Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to be covering the new La La Land Records 60th anniversary soundtrack CD release of John Barry's iconic Goldfinger score. This is a release that none of us expected, but a unbelievably welcome one, considering the exceptional work La La Land has done with their past Bond score releases, and one can only hope that this is merely a sign of future releases to come, as it is actually being officially supported by Eon, with all international sales of this release being on the official 007 store website. So it seems like La La Land is finally getting some more attention in terms of the Bond soundtrack releases, and since they've been going along being able to do one soundtrack at a time tied to anniversary releases, one can only hope that there will be more to come. Now, the Goldfinger score really needs no introduction. It is really the score where all of the core elements of the Bond identity in terms of the cinematic James Bond, John Barry's style, and laying the musical foundation of the series, it's where it all comes together, just as the film itself is seen as the point at which the James Bond formula fully crystallized. It is often referred to as the James Bond film that had it all, and the same can be said for the score. This is even apparent when you compare the Goldfinger score to Barry's own From Russia with Love score, which, while that score suits the film perfectly, it doesn't quite have the same sort of cynical, sardonic quality throughout every aspect of it that you find in the Goldfinger score. You very much get the sense that in Goldfinger, Barry found the unique sort of signifying style that naturally grew out of reacting to the film and brought his own sort of brand of wit and cynicism that picks up on the elements of the James Bond character, but also bringing in his signature usage of brass that will run throughout the entirety of the Bond scores, and a further sort of focus. The score itself is exceptionally well timed and well suited to the film, and that also helps because Goldfinger, along with Dr. No, was the shortest running Bond film of the original series at an hour and 51 minutes. The score overall very much picks up on the sly tone of the film itself, which is very much tied to director Guy Hamilton's approach and the sort of lighter, larger-than-life adventure style that he very much favored, as opposed to the much more hard-hitting Terrence Young style of the first two films. And I think Barry's scores for both From Russia with Love and Goldfinger reflect this sort of tonal shift. And ever since Goldfinger, the entire paradigm of the Bond series was forever altered to feature this lighter touch and less overall gritty realism in areas, and of course the greater focus on gadgetry. But it is a foundational work, and it's very necessary that the score reflects this. It's also the only film that had screenwriting contributions from the co-writer Paul Dane, who had a very unique sardonic wit that very much infuses itself into the film. And I think John Barry really picked up on this. And in scoring his second James Bond film, I think he was able to sort of fine-tune and hone in on elements of his first score that worked and were really successful, but elevate things further. And he would always refer back to this score in interviews as probably his favorite of his Bond scores, as it was where everything really came together. It's very much a lightning in a bottle moment for not just the score, but of course the film itself. The title song with the iconic Shirley Bassey vocal gets most of the attention, and of course deservedly so, because it's essentially the most iconic of all of the James Bond title songs and really set the precedent for what a James Bond title song should be. But it often, I think, steals a lot of the limelight from Barry's actual score, which is just a complete work of genius from start to finish. There's not a single cue that doesn't burn itself into the brain of every Bond fan who's ever seen the film. And just looking at the cues on their own in terms of the soundtrack release outside of the film, the sense of drama, the sense of wit and style and elegance, and again, a focus is just absolutely astonishing. This is a score that is one for the ages, and it's quite frankly amazing that Barry was able to do this only with his second score for the series. He was the master of James Bond scoring because he wrote the how to score a James Bond film playbook that everybody else has to follow. But it's also a score that wouldn't have happened had Barry not had success with his From Russia with Love score. So just like the film, I think it was important to have a success under one's belt to then come back to the third film in the series and try to double down on aspects that worked, follow the new tone of the film, which was dramatically different to the first two films, and also, Barry's having to do some heavier lifting in terms of the music, having to carry significant portions of the film. As a lot of fans like to point out, this is a story where James Bond is actually a prisoner for a significant portion of the plot, and thus takes a more passive role. So in those instances, the score does have to really pick up certain areas and keep the overall plot threads moving, and underline how Bond's mind is continually racing, trying to outwit Goldfinger, but also to help combat against a plot that's actually a bit more passive in areas because, again, the idea that Bond is actually a prisoner for a good portion of the narrative. But it should, again, be stressed that Barry was also master of knowing when not to score or when to only have a cue that was very specifically tied to individual moments as to not overpower them and to not have to battle against the sound effects. So it's actually a score that you think is actually much longer than it really is. It's unfortunate that we aren't able to have the complete score as elements are seemingly no longer in existence, which I'll get to in a bit when I cover more of the technical details. But even in regards to looking at how much music there is in the film, it's actually a lot less than you would think. But because the cues and the music spotting and the music itself is so focused to specific moments, that gives the music greater resonance, a great sense of dramatic weight, but also Barry allows for the music to play with the individual themes and always reflecting on the lighter Guy Hamilton style that literally defines Goldfinger as a film. It's picking up on a newfound sense of levity and allowing the sort of additional grandeur, or what the literary James Bond would refer to as the soft life, the elegance of high living. This is reflected in the score. So the score and the tone of the film are so simpatico that they are essentially one and the same. I think this was Barry's greatest talent in scoring a James Bond film. It's the area where he is unmatched and why he's the master of scoring James Bond films. Again, it helps that he wrote the playbook that everyone had to follow, but also it should be examined that the actual recording of the score seems to have been a bit fancier because they had more money to play with, because they had now two successful films under their belt, and it seems Barry took full advantage of this because the actual recording of the score, when you pay attention to the actual sound quality, it seems it just a bit more polished as well, and I think that also goes hand in hand with Barry being a more confident film composer and everybody being more confident because they were on the third film of an increasingly successful series. So there's confidence throughout the entirety of Goldfinger. That really helps to sell every element of the film. But it really is that lightning in a bottle moment for the series. This was the point at which, in all aspects of the Eon James Bond films, where the future was still unwritten, but everybody had had successes with the first two films. They had a solid, fantastic adaptation of one of Fleming's best novels. They knew what pathway to take to get to the finish line, essentially. But at this point, they didn't have to worry about living up to the legacy of the series and having to best an entire series of films in terms of trying to top that. At this point, they only had two films that they had to equal or try and top and better. So it's always the first three films in the James Bond series that remain unique because they were the films before James Bond became a phenomenon. This happened with the release of Goldfinger when Bond Mania took the world by storm and basically spawned the spy craze of the 1960s. So I think that's another distinction to even look at the scores for, because when they were making Goldfinger, when Barry was composing his score and when they were producing the title song, it wasn't iconic. You have to try and distance yourself 60 years later from the entire iconic status of all of Goldfinger as a film in all of its aspects, and of course the score and the title song. You have to keep in mind that they knew it would be successful when they were making this, but they didn't know it was going to make the entire world lose their minds. And so on Thunderball, when they had to then try and top Goldfinger, they were also having to deal with the spy craze that had started and all of the increasing number of competitors, but also they had to worry more about the business side of things. So there is a difference between Goldfinger and Thunderball, because with Thunderball, the future was no longer completely open. They had established the James Bond formula, and Goldfinger was a different film in tone and style than the first two films, which were then reissued, and a lot of people actually saw the first two films after Goldfinger. So there was still a lot of possibilities, but it was a lot harder to be as original and as fresh and exciting. And when you look at Barry's score for Thunderball, he's really scoring an epic. That's his first epic James Bond score that's not only incredibly dramatic and bigger than life, but the score itself is much more massive. It has a lot of the core tenets From Russia with Love and Goldfinger and follows in the same style, but it's also having to match a film that is much bigger in scale and, quite frankly, in and of itself is more of an epic production. So there is something to be said, again, as I said before, about one of the key things to focus on in terms of looking at the Goldfinger score in particular is such a sense of clarity and focus. The score is, again, not terribly long, but every cue is worth its weight in gold. Every cue is perfectly timed and honed to the specific moment that it is highlighting in the film, and always finding the right notes of the exotic, of danger, of adventure, of impending doom, but also the notes to play of humor and allowing those moments to resonate. It's actually a score and a film that at certain moments it allows time to play out, and that's a quality that lets those particular moments sink in. For example, moments such as the end of the golf confrontation, and most of all the sequence of Bond tracing Goldfinger through Switzerland in the DB5, where Barry finds an unbelievably iconic and majestic use of the main Goldfinger theme in the beautiful Alpine Drive rendition. So again, it's a score of remarkable focus, but also a perfect realization of the film's unique blending of luxury and the sardonic, of having a tight enough narrative to be only an hour and 51 minutes, but being the larger-than-life experience that it is. And so this is a score that starts with the iconic and incredibly arresting Bond back in action for the pre-title sequence, which is, I think, one of Barry's signature James Bond pieces. And then in the film's climax, we have another of John Barry's masterworks, which is completely different. And that, of course, is Dawn Raid on Fort Knox, which is an unbelievably dramatic piece because it continues to build and build and build before we have the explosion into the crash noises, but then taking things back down as the convoy moves on, seemingly unstoppable, into the inner workings of Fort Knox itself. And then, to get back to my point of Barry knowing when not to score, for the majority of the iconic fight between Bond and Oddjob inside of Fort Knox, it's not scored. And so it's the sound effects under the direction of Norman Wanstall that actually form the soundtrack. And I'm pretty much convinced that that particular sequence is the reason why Norman Wanstall won the Oscar for Goldfinger's sound design. But it takes a real genius composer to know when it's best to not get in the way. And then having music there would probably overplay one's hand, as the sequence itself is so incredibly dramatic that the sound effects become the soundtrack, and the lack of music is more dramatic than anything Barry could have put in there. It's the same reason why he didn't put music in the iconic train fight in From Russia with Love, and that's another reason why those two fight sequences remain the pinnacle of the entire series, in terms of being the untouchable pinnacle of fight sequences, and they themselves reflect the different styles of each film and each director. So I think they can very much be looked at in terms of really defining the difference between the Terrence Young style of the first two films and the Guy Hamilton style represented in Goldfinger. And they're tied together by the fact that they're really primarily driven by the drama of the scene, the action, and the sound effects, and John Barry knew that he needed to stay out of the way. But then you look at the sort of tag ending of Goldfinger that continues the precedent of essentially having an additional moment or additional action danger beat with the villain after what would be the climax of a normal film. That's where Barry comes back in with his score in order to really highlight that as the true finale of the film. So it again is a very adept score, and it's astonishing that it's not as long as one would think it is. Again, the word I always come back to when I listen to the Goldfinger score is focus. There's such a sense of focus and knowing what to do in order to reflect this new tone of the James Bond film series that was still growing and developing. But again, this is the point where everything crystallized, established the James Bond formula, and that is the biggest reason why Goldfinger is known as the Bond film that had it all, and it's why it took the world by storm. Of course, it had the success of the first two films to sort of build in some of an audience, but Goldfinger is what blew the doors open and got everybody to sit up and take notice. And of course, the soundtrack was unbelievably successful, also helped by the incredible success of Bassie's title song, sweeping the world, but also that had an alternative single mix, which is really important because the vocal on that's an entirely different performance, and that version, unfortunately, for a great number of years was sort of lost to time outside of a few releases here and there. But thankfully, that has also been addressed here on this release as well, so this is important for a great number of reasons. Now, in terms of the score's releases over the years, there's actually quite a bit of variations. On the original 1964 soundtrack release, of course, the score was released to LP in both stereo, as it was a stereo recording, and then also there were mono LPs made. Basically, the first four Bond films through Thunderball had the score releases in mono and stereo, and the mono is usually a fold down or a reduction of the stereo mix. But on Goldfinger, you have to look at the US and UK albums separately, because not only did they have different cover artwork, but they had entirely different track listings. For the most part of the program, they remained the same, but the UK album had 4 additional tracks of Barry's score, which for some reason were left off of the US release, and the American album merely substituted a really fantastic instrumental version of the title song that's frequently been described as almost having a sort of surf rock vibe to it. It's iconic in and of itself, but it really was just sort of tacked on for the American release. But unfortunately, it took the place of 4 John Barry cues. And also, that instrumental was only recorded in mono, so it sounds best on a mono LP, as the stereo version just seems like a fake stereo version of that original mono recording. But the rest of the album is in stereo. When you compare the US and UK copies, because it's 1960s vinyl, it's very difficult to get original copies in good shape without lots of groove wear. But because the actual score was so well recorded, they still sound excellent. But the original UK pressing, if you can find it, has not only more of Barry's score, but does sound significantly better and has significantly less vinyl surface noise. But in any case, it still remains a fantastic sounding soundtrack album for the 1960s, as when you get most 60s soundtracks today, if you can find them in good shape, of course, even if the score was a great recording, it didn't necessarily always translate to the vinyl release. And of course, you had to deal with the soundtrack usually being cut down significantly to fit onto a single LP. Again, as I mentioned, the single version of the Goldfinger title song is basically a unique version with a completely different vocal by Shirley Bassey, with basically the backing track being the same as what we know from the film version. So it's a unique version of the song that itself became a hit record, and so most people would have probably been more familiar with the single version with the alternate vocal, which is noticeably different in areas, so it's extraordinarily important to preserve, and that single version seems to have been finished in mono. But that single version that was such a big seller, unfortunately, after that point sort of got lost to time and would only sporadically appear here and there, usually on Shirley Bassey compilations over the years. So before this point, that was really the only way you could have the 1964 hit single version outside of having an original 45, which is tricky to find in good shape and not paying through the nose for it. There were a variety of reissues over the years, basically following the same pattern as the rest of the James Bond scores as they bounced around from different labels and reissue practices. United Artists Records would just reissue the scores on LP with updated labels, but they seem to basically follow the sort of country of origin rules. So if you have a US reissue, such as a 70s or 80s copy, it's just going to reuse the American track listing, and then most of the UK reissues would reuse the UK track listing. But eventually things sort of got standardized, and so when the first CDs started coming out in the 80s, we didn't really get anything fancy or really impressive for the Bond scores. They basically did the run of EMI CDs in the late 1980s, early 1990s that were replicating the vinyl LP program, and usually it was always the American program for Goldfinger, so it didn't have all of the John Barry cues. This was finally addressed in 1992 for the Best of James Bond 30th Anniversary set, and this is the original version with a second disc entirely of additional and alternate rare tracks and cues. Not only does this have the 4 John Barry cues from the original UK album, but it has the Anthony Newley demo of Goldfinger, which is fascinating for being a completely different version and take. And it was very much a sort of working iteration of the song to give a feel of what it could be in its finished form, but it was never intended to be the version used in the film. But this was really fantastic for us Bond nerds because we could only read about this before. There was apparently a second demo as well that had a different style, but as far as I or anyone knows, I don't think that's ever surfaced. But this set has been important ever since for the unique materials such as the Anthony Newley demo and especially the alternate versions of Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang with vocals, including the second version that Shirley Bassey did, that still remain unique to this 2-disc set. We had to wait until 2003 for there to be an update for the James Bond scores, and that arrived in the form of the Capitol remasters. Now, these were supervised by Lucas Kendall, and he was able to produce expanded versions of select scores, but unfortunately didn't have the budget or label support to really dig through the archives and do very fancy and intensive work. But he did the best that he could, and on Goldfinger he was able to source the tracks from the UK album. So this was the first time we had all of the original album tracks from both versions on a single release. Of course, they weren't able to do film order as they had to keep the original US track listing, but the UK tracks are included at the end. Also, the quality of the UK tracks is much better than the 1992 CD, which seemed to have used quite a bit of noise reduction. So this was not only fantastic to finally get all of the album material on one release, but the UK tracks are better quality than the 1992 CD. The only problem is that they couldn't get the Anthony Newley demo, so that meant you still had to have the 1992 release for that. The 2003 release was extremely well mastered and a big jump forward in sound quality over the past digital releases, and finally gave us both the US and UK album tracks on one release. The 2003 version is what most people are going to have in their collection, and it's going to be what most people have as their frame of reference, as it already sounds great, and so people are going to sort of wonder if it's worth upgrading to the La La Land release, which for the most part, is the same material in terms of the US and UK album tracks. Now, the reason for that is that, unfortunately, it seems that all of the source materials for the complete score of the film are no longer in existence. And that's partially due to the fact that it seems that for the first three films, the rights holders, Eon, MGM, now Amazon, of course, they don't have the original separate stems for all of the first three films in terms of the dialogue, music, and effects. They seem to have certain elements for producing foreign dubs back in the day, as the only method you have of getting all of Barry's score for the film in terms of what's not available on any of the soundtrack releases is the legendary Criterion CAV Special Edition Laserdisc, which most people know for having the quote-unquote band commentaries, but Goldfinger has an isolated music and effects track on analog track 1. So that means you can at least get a version of the music and effects track without the dialogue. Unfortunately, it's only Laserdisc analog, which is already limited quality, and the actual source they used back in 1991 for this was limited quality, so it doesn't sound all that great. And I know the folks at La La Land and Neil Bulk and everybody working on this release did actually look at this, but again, the quality is really limited, so that's why they really couldn't use anything from this. But for Bond fans who have always wanted all of Barry's score, the only method you really have of getting those little pieces, such as the nightclub source music from the pre-titles, is the analog track from the Criterion Laserdisc. So with the heartbreaking thought out of the way of unfortunately not being able to source any of the additional music to make a 100% complete release, this would again lead most fans to think that maybe they don't need the new La La Land 60th anniversary CD if they've already got the 2003 CD, which again sounds great in its own right. So to now talk about the sound quality and overall presentation and the tracks on the La La Land anniversary release, I would say to anyone who thinks that they're just okay with the 2003 CD that I completely understand that thinking, but you need to hear just a track or two of the new La La Land version to fully get the impact of the incredible rabbit they've pulled out of the hat with this. As most fans are probably aware, the actual Goldfinger source tapes for the score are of a certain limited quality. There's certain source defects that are sort of baked in that are apparent in the 2003 release, and not having any new material, one might think that there's not much more they could pull out of that same material in terms of doing a new transfer of the same elements. So it's understandable to think that this might only be a marginal improvement over the 2003 mastering. Well, you would be dead wrong, because all you have to do is put on the new La La Land release, which is also finally in film order. So we have all of the American and UK album tracks in film order on a release for the first time. So no more jumping around or resequencing on your own. But this release was produced by Neil Bulk. It was engineered with the sonic wizardry of Chris Malone, and it was mastered by Doug Schwartz. And they've been really involved with the past La La Land score releases and Bond scores. But those three names combined automatically should make most soundtrack fans know that this has legitimacy and is worth checking into, even if there's not really a whole lot of new material in terms of new content, not on the 2003 CD. But I have to say, as I've talked about and other things that Chris Malone has worked on, I don't know how he did it, but the overall engineering, this new mastering, this new mix of the stereo album, there are details that simply are not there on past releases. It is absolutely mind-boggling. There is a sense from the get-go at the start of Bond Back in the Action, which is now fittingly and finally the first track on the release because we finally have film order. There's a sense of spaciousness and clarity in the mid-range and the high-end that I didn't think existed in the source material. I was noticing and hearing elements of the score that had never been this clear or really audible before. You can much more clearly pick out a lot of the fine detail and instrumentation that in past releases, even the 2003 master, which was great in its own right, where it was a bit more buried or distant. Even the title song, which you don't think could sound much better than what it does on the 2003 release, manages to have some additional clarity and even doesn't have the hard pan to the right on the final drum note. That's now centered, which I was amazed by. There was also attention paid to some of the source defects and things that always bugged me on the 2003 master. For example, there's some annoying distortion at the start of Bond Back in Action that's kind of always been there. That has been addressed to the best of one's ability without utilizing destructive techniques, because Chris Malone has said in interviews his approach is very much archival minded, and that's how he always tries to approach every project he works on. So while there are still some moments where you might notice an occasional bit or two of sort of fleeting noise or inherent defects, that is simply inherent to the source. And because this new master is so much clearer than anything we've had before, it makes those a little bit more apparent. So if you suddenly think, well, I've never heard that before, I didn't hear that on, and I've had the 2003 CD for years. Well, if you go back and you look really, really closely, you can actually find it. It's stuff that's kind of always been there. Some of it goes all the way back to the original vinyl releases. But because all past releases didn't have this level of clarity to them, you might have not noticed them. So if you notice one or two moments that might seem like, oh, that's a defect, or that's a little bit of noise here or something, it's because everything is so much more clear that now you can actually pick out that stuff more. But it's been sort of tamed down as much as humanly possible without actually affecting any of the sound or the original recording. It has been handled as best as humanly possible with surgical precision without ever getting into any destructive noise reduction. And if you're curious about what some of these tracks can sound like if they have too much noise reduction, all you have to do is go to the UK album tracks on the 1992 disc 2, because those had quite a bit and have most, if not all, of the tape hiss removed. There's even a sense of low end at times that is natural on the new La La Land master that was not even on the 2003 CD. So not only is there a greater sense of clarity, a greater sense of fine detail, just a sense of vastly opening up the mid-range and the high-end on the 60th anniversary release, but there's a more natural low-end. So honestly, the entire sound spectrum feels like it's been opened up. It's honestly as good as the 2003 CD was, and as great as the original UK stereo pressing still sounds 60 years later. You almost get the feeling that we've been listening to something that wasn't necessarily the original source for all of these years. That is the dramatic difference in this new mastering. And never once is there any major dynamic range loss or anything. So when you look at this release compared to the 2003 CD, it is pretty much the same track for track in terms of the overall dynamic range. And it's got better handling of the sort of trouble spots inherent to this source tape. So this basically takes everything the 2003 remaster did and pushes it into the stratosphere in terms of going so much further, especially with the benefit of modern technology, being able to dig more deeply into materials, and it's much easier to actually address trouble spots. I think this is a night and day improvement over the already excellent 2003 remaster. I think this is quite staggering in terms of, if you're a longtime fan and you're listening to this, especially with headphones on or a good quality setup, you're going to notice details you simply haven't noticed to this degree before. But again, the sense of space in the mids and the upper ranges, that it just leaps out at you. And if you just go to listen to a track or two, you will sit there and listen to the entirety of the soundtrack release because you can't stop, because it's got such a sense of newfound clarity on every single track that I don't think exists on the past releases to this degree. So I think this has all of the positives of the original UK stereo pressing from 1964 and all of the positives of the 2003 remaster, and even more positives because I think it vaults ahead of even those, in spite of it still having to work from the same limited materials the 2003 remaster did, and those materials having some source defects and also being 60 years old. It is absolutely mind-blowing how good this sounds. I did not think it would be this much of an improvement over the 2003 CD. I thought at best it might be, 10 to 20% better, or just a little bit better, a little bit clearer with the new work that had been done and all of the great personnel involved, basically being able to advance a little bit beyond what the 2003 remaster did. But trust me, they went beyond that. This is a staggering improvement across the board. I myself, as a Bond completist and a collector of the soundtracks, will of course hang on to all my previous versions, but if someone was just wanting the best version of the Goldfinger score, it is this. This is really, I think, as good as it can possibly be. Unless the materials for the rest of the score that was never released on album could somehow be located and added to this release, this is as good as it gets. This is a staggering improvement over the 2003 master, which itself was excellent and remains the second best sounding version alongside the original UK stereo LP. But again, I did not think it was humanly possible to make this score sound like this. And again, it's not from manipulating anything, it's from doing the work as best as you possibly can and ensuring that across the entirety of the release, from start to finish and the final mastering of the CD itself, is done to the highest quality standard. This is the type of workflow and effort that has always been needed for the films in terms of their restorations and video masters, and unfortunately they've never gotten that. So again, the La La Land release of a James Bond score is actually a better restoration from start to finish, a better presentation, and better release than the actual film has. And if you're curious about what's the best sounding release of the actual Goldfinger film's original mono mix, unfortunately, it's quite sad because you have to go back quite a long ways to get the most untouched, hands-off, best-sounding presentation of the original audio for Goldfinger. You have to go back to the 1988 MGM UA home video master, which is only in the 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio, so not the original aspect ratio, but obviously also not technically pan and scanned either. It is essentially opened up from the original 1.66 to 1, but still not the intended way to see it. But this release on Laserdisc Analog and VHS Hi-Fi has the best presentation of the original mono mix that you can possibly get. So if you want the full premium high fidelity audio experience for Goldfinger in both original soundtrack and film, you need the new La La Land 60th anniversary release and either the 1988 Laserdisc or MGM VHS of Goldfinger to have a mono soundtrack presentation that at least is the best you can do in terms of fidelity to the film's original audio mix. But of course, the La La Land release also has bonuses of its own, and these are placed at the end of the album as, again, the album is finally in complete film order. So the three bonuses are, of course, the instrumental of Goldfinger that was found on the US release, which is in its original mono form, also sounding better than the version on the 2003 CD. And then we have another appearance of the Anthony Newley demo of Goldfinger. And for this, it's basically the same presentation as the already great sounding version on the 1992 CD release, as they basically had to source it from the same place. So it seems like the same exact transfer. So it's basically like a porting of the same track on the 1992 CD release, which is the only release we have. And it sounds great. Thankfully, it didn't get hit with a bunch of noise reduction like the album tracks did on that particular disc. So it's basically a one-to-one copy of that same presentation. So if you have the 1992 CD, it's the same great quality on this. But for those who don't have this tricky-to-find complete 2 CD set from 1992, you now have it here on this release. And then we close with the Goldfinger single version from 1964. And this is really important. This is definitely the track that is the biggest draw for Bond completists and collectors, because the Goldfinger single version has not been released all that often since 1964, and it's usually not always in the best quality, so you have to try to track down a version of it on a particular CD that at least sounds pretty solid. But this is also a new restoration of the Goldfinger single version, as Neil Bulk has said that he had to actually go in and work on it because the original single recording had echoes of Bassie's film vocal in the actual final mix. So because the backing track was the film version music, there was some echo essentially of her actual iconic film vocal. So it was seemingly a recording process that was put together rather quickly when they made the single version. So it was never as polished or as fancy sounding as the iconic film version, but it was the hit version of 1964. So it's incredibly important to preserve, but we've never had a beautiful new restoration of the iconic hit single version with a completely alternate vocal as we now have here on the La La Land release. So this isn't just a copy of the original single version. It's not just a new transfer of the original single version. It's a complete restoration of the original single version with the unique and unbelievably important and unbelievably fascinating alternate Shirley Bassey vocal, which can be looked at as an alternate what if, in terms of what if this had been the actual version that everybody knows. Because in 1964, outside of seeing the film or having the actual soundtrack, this was the version you heard everywhere. It was the version that was played on radio. It was the version everybody bought as the hit single, because even in 1964, it was still a bit more of a singles market. In terms of single sales, we're still sort of dominating over album sales, although that paradigm would start to shift. But it's incredibly important to preserve the alternate single version of Goldfinger. And amazing that they took the time on this release to not only include it, source it, transfer it, but actually do a complete restoration to address original defects of the original version that would have probably at least been addressed a bit more had it been seemingly not quite as rushed of a process in making the single version. So again, this underlines how I think this release really leaves no stone unturned, because they even did a brand new restoration of the 1964 single version that had kind of been lost to time, and usually only Shirley Bassey fans and us James Bond nerds would talk about the alternate single 45 mix of Goldfinger. So in terms of the packaging and artwork, we have, of course, the jewel case, which is replicating the iconic and gorgeous original UK artwork, which I have here on the original UK stereo pressing. So if you're used to the American release with the red text, this might take a little getting used to, but this is indeed the original UK artwork. Apologies for the glare. It's always hard to hold up a jewel case in these videos, but as you can see, it has been modified slightly to include the new 60th anniversary edition banner, but otherwise is a loving replication of the original UK artwork. We have the same limited edition 007 inside the spine that is signifying this as following along the same trends of the Live and Let Die and Octopussy scores. A nice new spine with the information and a La La Land credit. And then the new rear cover, which uses the rest of the original UK artwork from some of the one sheets and half sheets. And then the track listing with complete film order, and then the 3 additional tracks at the end. So again, this is only a 47-minute album, but don't let that fool you, because this, of course, is one of John Barry's masterpieces presented as best as humanly possible. And of course, like all La La Land releases, this is a limited edition of only 5,000 units, but since this has official Eon support and is being sold internationally on the 007 store, and because it's Goldfinger and it's not as expensive a release as most boutique soundtrack releases usually are, this is going to sell out more quickly than other releases. And with the incredible upgrade in sound quality, I would recommend picking this up sooner rather than later, because if you miss out on this, even if you have the 2003 CD, you will regret it if you ever hear samples of what this sounds like, because the difference is staggering. So we have the actual booklet, and this has been given a really nice high gloss finish. So that sort of shininess you see is the wonderful gloss finish. And also the paper is a bit thicker and has a more premium feel. Now, this has beautiful imagery, as all the La La Land booklets do, but this seems like they really took the trouble to get as high quality of image as they could. The essay is a modified version of John Burlingame's chapter in his book, just as we saw on the Live and Let Die and Octopussy releases. And if you don't have that book, Burlingame's The Music of James Bond is the essential tome on the James Bond scores and one of the essential James Bond reference books. So even if you're just a passing fan of the scores, you still need to read this book. So basically, this is a slightly condensed version of his chapter on Goldfinger here. So if you like what you read here, and you will, you need to get his book to read the little bit of extra material and get his incredible coverage of the other Bond scores. Again, more beautiful imagery, and I think they really knocked it out of the park with the layout on this, along with the really nice high gloss finish and the lovely layout of the text. So I think this is a beautifully designed booklet just in terms of CD booklets. There is, thankfully, a little bit of additional text by Burlingame in his essay about this release in particular, being the 60th anniversary, and finally presenting the entire score in film order. So it is at least a little bit of extra information as compared to his book chapter. So if you're like me and you've read his book many times, in this booklet there's at least a little bit more in terms of the last couple paragraphs about this release in particular. And then, of course, we close here with the credits and the credits for the new work, again, produced by Neil Bulk, engineering by Chris Malone, and mastered by Doug Schwartz, and then all the wonderful folks at La La Land Records behind this incredible release. And, of course, closing on the iconic still of Connery nonchalantly leaning against the DB5 in The Beauty of Switzerland. For the CD label, of course, it is in the same style as Live and Let Die and Octopussy, with a beautiful bare rim, and the label itself is gold. What other color could it be? And for the tray image, we have a nice shot of Bond and Pussy for Bond's arrival in Kentucky off of the Auric Enterprises jet. Because, of course, with this soundtrack being so superb, you just want to keep playing it easy. So overall, that is the new La La Land Records 60th anniversary release of John Barry's masterful and iconic Goldfinger score. While unfortunately not the complete score all of us Bond fans would hope for, that is unfortunately not really a possibility due to the original elements not all completely surviving. But for what does survive, and the actual original album tracks from the American and British releases, and all of the additional tracks that survive in terms of the 3 additional tracks, this is beyond exemplary. Even if you have the already excellent 2003 CD, you still need this release. The difference in sound quality just between the great 2003 master and this new 2024 master is staggering. Again, I don't say it lightly when I talk about Chris Malone's work and describing it as somehow being sonic wizardry. I don't know how he and everyone involved in this project managed to make this score sound this good from the source elements that survive. There is additional space and clarity and detail that is simply not there in past releases. As much as I love listening to all of them, I did go back and compare everything once again because I was so blown away at what I was hearing on this new 2024 master that I had to just go and double check everything. And again, I think it manages on the 2024 mastering to have some of the great aspects of the original UK stereo pressing that are unique to that, and all the great aspects of the 2003 mastering. So it's basically building off of everything that came before and revealing more of the source tape than what we've ever had. You've never heard the score sound quite this good. I guarantee it, because even just jumping back and forth between this and the 2003 CD, there's clarity and detail and depth and information that simply was either obscured or a bit buried or not even there on the 2003 CD. And that itself was great in and of its own right. So just because this CD is only, 47 minutes long and only really giving you, in terms of new exclusive to this release, the new restoration of the original single mix of Goldfinger. Don't let that discourage you from picking this up. This disc is worth its weight in gold just as much as the Live and Let Die and Octopussy releases. So even though it's unfortunately not the complete score, this release is made and produced and executed across the board as best as humanly possible. This is the release we've always wanted. This is the release we always knew was possible for each of the Bond scores. The 2003 remasters did the best they could for the most part with the limited time frame and small budget and things, but there was always the possibility to go back and make each score's presentation on disc the best it possibly could be with what survives. We now finally have that for one of the most iconic of all James Bond scores, for what is arguably still the most iconic of the entire series, the film and the score that set the precedent for everything that followed, the moment where lightning was captured in a bottle for all time, which can be heard to its greatest aural splendor that it's ever had on a physical media release. That is, of course, John Barry's masterpiece score for Goldfinger. I hope my babbles about this astonishing release of the Goldfinger score and the continued incredible work of La La Land and the whole team behind these releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative, and I hope I have convinced every James Bond fan to support this release. Its list price is only $22 US. Of course, if you're in international territories, you'll have to order through the 007 store, and here in the US, it's exclusively being sold on the La La Land website for a run. So those are your two options. But the shipping is not terribly expensive. Yes, it's still a boutique soundtrack release, but do not let any of that deter you. This is the best release of the Goldfinger score we have ever seen, and short of the additional cues turning up somewhere someday, this is as good as it gets. This is an astoundingly well-made release that has such an increase in sound quality that most of us, especially myself, I never thought possible with this particular score. I thought the 2003 master was probably about as good as it was going to get. I expected this release's mastering to only be able to improve certain areas, not all aspects, which it does. This is such a dramatic upgrade in sound quality that I think it's just as substantial as the Octopussy and Live and Let Die releases. That's how substantial the overall quality increase is. Again, you will hear elements that simply were either obscured or not there before, and the sense of space in the recording that is restored to the sound is just stunning. It really does feel throughout like you're hearing some of these cues for the first time. So again, I think this is as good as it gets for handling the Goldfinger score. And this is the exact type of work and effort that I myself have always hoped would happen with the actual films. If we could finally get a release of the Goldfinger film done to this quality level of standard across the board in scanning, restoration, preservation of both picture and sound and the original audio mix, there would finally be a definitive release of the film that has never been. So again, I think La La Land is leading the charge for James Bond preservation that hopefully Eon will finally follow with a proper 4K UHD release of the original films. And I think it's unbelievably sad that now we finally have a best possible release of the film's score, but the film itself still languishes in a variety of problems and outdated masters and poor treatment of the original audio mix. So with Eon now being on board supporting these releases officially and being the international sellers on the 007 store, maybe, hopefully, this will encourage them to finally do the proper restoration of the original films and release fully up-to-date 4K HDR masters on UHD in the proper definitive releases that the films have always deserved and never really gotten. Quite simply, this new La La Land release and restoration of John Barry's Goldfinger score I mean, it really is the James Bond event of 2024. That is how amazing this release is. That is how well produced to every last detail this release is. And just the astonishing increase in sound quality alone makes it the James Bond event of 2024, short of La La Land maybe announcing another Bond score release. This is such an important milestone for James Bond fandom in terms of getting arguably the most iconic score for the most iconic film in the series, the best possible release that it could have with what survives. So, again, I stress, if you're at all a fan of the film and Barry's score, you need this release. Even if you're like me and you have basically every iteration you could get, you still need this release because the sound quality improvement is so vast that you'll notice it from the first listen. It's also beautiful to see the overall package design, the attention to detail, the inclusion of the bonus tracks, and actually doing a new restoration of the long forgotten 1964 single mix that was so important for promoting the film and continuing its legacy throughout that year and the peak of Bond mania leading into the build up to Thunderball. So again, this release is done as best as humanly possible. It is worth its weight in gold. It is worth every penny. It's worth more, far more than the purchase price, which is quite low for a boutique soundtrack release. So because this is limited to only 5,000 copies and has official Eon support, if you're at all interested, and if you call yourself a James Bond fan, you should be, definitely pick up a copy of this before it sells out, and also help show your support to incredible efforts like this, which will only help to further the cause of preservation of the James Bond franchise, and of course ensure further releases by La La Land of more score restorations and expansions, but also hopefully indicate to the powers that be at Eon and elsewhere that it is important to pay the same level of care and attention to the actual original film series, because we do need to have this level of quality in the releases of the films because they've never gotten that. So it is the La La Land releases really leading the charge for the absolute pinnacle of preserving the magical world of 007 in physical media, and finally giving us soundtrack releases that are as good as humanly possible. So I encourage every James Bond fan in the world to consider getting the La La Land Goldfinger release. It is a staggering upgrade in sound quality. It is a beautifully produced overall package that has such a level of care and quality put into it that you know that everyone involved really put in 110% in terms of trying to make this as good as they possibly could. So it is truly one of the few James Bond releases that I can actually say that, because I know the work that went into it, and it really shows. It really shows track for track. So if you call yourself a James Bond fan and you don't pick up the La La Land release of Goldfinger, especially since it's not particularly very expensive, then I don't know what you're doing. It is the James Bond event of 2024, and fittingly a perfect way to celebrate the legacy of the James Bond film that not only set and formalized the James Bond formula, but is often regarded as the James Bond film that had it all. So as always, please do keep supporting the incredible efforts and hard work and dedication of the boutique soundtrack labels who are helping to preserve our cinematic music heritage. And as always, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.